My name is Clara. I'm 29 years old, and for the past few years, I've made a habit of traveling. I love exploring new cities' cultures and meeting new people. As a journalist, finding unusual stories has always been part of the job, but none of them would turn out to be as terrifying or as real as the one I would experience. I didn't know back then, before checking into that cursed hotel, that I would never forget that night. Last week for work, I was attending a major conference in another city. The conference was scheduled to last one day, and then I would stay a few more days for business meetings. Everything was going well. However, something went wrong at the hotel. The hotel was in an old building, very close to the city center. The exterior was old, yet elegant. Everything had a classic historic feel to it. The staff was polite and helpful, and at first, everything seemed perfectly normal. When I stepped into the hotel, I noticed something odd but didn't think much of it. The receptionist looked at me a little longer than necessary, but I shrugged it off. I grabbed my bag and headed up to my room. The elevator was a little strange. It was old with dim lighting and a slightly eerie atmosphere. It felt more like stepping into a vintage building than a modern hotel. When I entered my room, it was a bit of a surprise. It had antique furniture and it felt oddly deserted. It wasn't like a typical hotel room. I began inspecting the room. I gazed out of the window at the city lights, feeling somewhat at ease. But then a strange feeling washed over me. There was something off about this place. I didn't get much sleep that first night. Around midnight, strange noises started coming from the walls. Tiny, rhythmic taps mixed with what sounded like faint cries. Then, in the dark corner of the room, I saw a shadowy figure. I jumped out of bed in terror. But when I turned on the lights, the room was empty. I spent the rest of the night awake, but by morning, everything seemed normal again. I brushed it off and headed to breakfast, convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The following day, the oddities grew more pronounced. I didn't experience anything that night, but when I woke up, I noticed that things in my room had moved. The chairs were rearranged, and the bed looked as though someone had remade it, even though I hadn't touched it. The sheets were uneven. I tried to ignore it, but I felt increasingly uneasy. I spoke to the staff, but they all assured me there was nothing to worry about. "You're just overtired, Clara," they said. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, I decided to have dinner in the hotel restaurant. The other guests seemed strange. Some of them gave me odd looks, their eyes lingering just a bit too long, but I didn't know what to make of it. After dinner, I returned to my room. I opened the door, and there, in the dark, stood a figure. It was a woman, but her body was grotesque, distorted in ways I couldn't explain. I froze in terror. The figure slowly walked toward the corner of the room and then disappeared. I couldn't understand what I had seen, but I knew one thing. I would never return to that hotel. The next morning, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I quickly grabbed my bags, checked out, and called a taxi to take me to the airport. But even as I left, I felt that strange feeling following me, like the hotel wasn't quite done with me. The memories of what had happened there kept lingering in my mind. When I arrived home, I thought I had finally escaped. I tried to go on with my life. But that night, everything changed. As I lay in bed, I began hearing the same tapping sounds from the walls, the same eerie noises I had heard in the hotel. My heart raced. I got up to check the apartment, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the noises. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the fear. Then, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The door to my bedroom creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the same woman I had seen in the hotel. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty. I couldn't move. She took a step forward, and with a voice that chilled me to the bone, she said, "I'm with you now, Clara. Forever." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, but she followed me. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to close in around me. My vision blurred and my legs gave way. When I opened my eyes again, I was still in my bed, sweat soaking through my sheets. The next morning, I could barely remember what had happened, but the fear was real. The woman was still with me. She had followed me home, and there was no escaping her. I tried to ignore it, but every time I closed my eyes, I could feel her presence. The only thing I could do was leave everything behind, but I knew I couldn't outrun her. The curse had followed me, and I was trapped. The next day, I packed my things and left my apartment. But as I walked down the empty hallway, I felt her cold fingers brush against my neck. I knew that no matter where I went, she would always be there, watching, waiting, forever. My name is Emre. I'm 32 years old, and I made the decision to change my life a few weeks ago by moving to a new place. I had grown tired of my old house, and I wanted a fresh start. A friend recommended an old house for me to rent, located a bit outside of the city. At first glance, it seemed perfect. Large, spacious, in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by nature. Everything looked fine. When I first stepped into the house, there was a strange silence, but I figured it was just the kind of quiet you get in a house that's been empty for a while. I began settling in, and things were going smoothly at first. But over time, strange things started to happen. I tried to dismiss them as minor inconveniences: squeaky doors, temperature changes, and faint noises at night. I told myself it was just the old structure of the house. One night when I was home alone, something odd happened. It was around 2 a.m., and I was trying to sleep. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe some noise from outside, but the footsteps were too distinct, too deliberate. They were coming closer to my room. I quickly jumped out of bed, turned on the lights, and checked, but there was no one there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, but by morning, everything seemed normal again. As the days went by, the strange occurrences continued. Objects seemed to move on their own. Weird noises filled the house at night, and sometimes I would hear tapping or faint whispers. One evening, I was sitting in the living room when I saw an old chair move on its own. The backrest slowly reclined as if someone had pushed it. I quickly turned the lights on, but the chair was perfectly still, and nothing else seemed out of place. I tried to explain it away, but the sense of dread grew stronger. One night, I woke up to find the light in my room was on, but I knew I had turned it off before going to bed. I slowly got out of bed and turned it off again, only to feel a strange weight on my chest. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't clear, just a dark shape, but I could feel its presence. I quickly looked away, and when I looked back, it was gone. I was shaking with fear. I quickly turned on the light, but there was nothing there. The next day, I decided to ask my neighbors about the house's history. One elderly woman gave me a strange look and said, "That house, it's been empty for a long time. No one stays there for long. It's old, and it has ghosts." I asked her what she meant, and she simply said, "People who live there don't stay for long. They leave. They never come back the same." That night, I couldn't shake off her words. I felt more and more uneasy in the house. The odd noises and unexplained occurrences escalated. The sounds of footsteps, whispers, and even things falling over at night became too much. One evening, I was watching TV when I noticed something in the reflection of the screen. In the corner of the reflection, I saw a face. A pale, hollow face with empty eyes staring at me. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing there. I was terrified. I immediately turned on all the lights, but I felt like I wasn't alone. The next day, I called a priest for help. Everyone had been telling me that there was something wrong with the house, and although it seemed illogical, I felt desperate to get rid of whatever was haunting me. The priest came over to the house and began walking through each room. He didn't seem surprised by anything. He started praying quietly. But when he was done, he looked at me and said, "There's a restless spirit in this house. I can help you remove it, but it will come with a price." I asked him what he meant, and he explained, "If I banish the spirit from this house, it will follow you. It will never leave you, but if you allow it to stay, it will never let you go. Either way, the spirit will affect your life." I was terrified, but after thinking about it, I decided to leave the spirit in the house. The next night, everything changed. The house seemed to come alive with a fury. Furniture was thrown around, the lights flickered violently, and doors slammed shut. It felt like the entire house was trembling. I tried to leave, but the fear paralyzed me. When the noise finally stopped, I went to bed exhausted, hoping it was all over. The next morning, everything seemed calm again. But something was different. The weight of the house's presence had grown stronger, and I felt like the spirit had followed me. I could no longer sleep peacefully. The noises continued, but now they were accompanied by shadowy figures. I was constantly aware of something watching me. A few weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night and found a figure standing in the doorway of my bedroom. The figure was distorted, twisted, like a dark shifting form that didn't belong. It stepped forward and I felt paralyzed. It moved closer and I could feel its cold breath on my skin. I couldn't move. My heart raced as it whispered my name. "Emre, you can never escape me." I knew at that moment that there was no way out. The house was cursed, and the spirit would follow me wherever I went. My life would never be the same. The price of leaving the spirit in the house was greater than I could have ever imagined. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house. I tried to start over, to escape the fear that had consumed me, but no matter where I went, it followed me. The spirit was always there, lurking just behind me, waiting. It was only a matter of time before it came for me. There was no escaping the curse of that house. My name is Ethan. I'm an archaeologist, and I have spent the better part of my life unearthing the secrets of the past. For years, I've worked on digs all over the world. Ancient ruins, lost civilizations, and long-forgotten relics. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened at that excavation site in the small, forgotten town of Oldbrook. It all began with a phone call from my professor, Dr. Andrews. He told me about a new site that had been discovered just outside Oldbrook. It was an untouched excavation site that had been buried for centuries, rumored to hold artifacts from a civilization that no one had ever studied. I was thrilled at the opportunity. This was the kind of discovery that could make a career. I packed my bags and set off immediately, eager to dig into the past. When I arrived, the town of Oldbrook seemed ordinary enough. It was a quiet place, tucked away in the countryside, with cobblestone streets and old houses. The excavation site was on the outskirts of town, a small hill that had once been the location of an ancient burial ground. The locals had always avoided the area, claiming that it was cursed, but I didn't pay much attention to their superstitions. Archaeology was based on facts, not stories. The site itself was eerie. The earth had been freshly disturbed, and the bones of ancient beings protruded from the ground. We set up camp and began digging, carefully uncovering the layers of history that lay hidden beneath the soil. Everything seemed normal for the first few days. We found pottery, old tools, and even some jewelry, but it was all relatively mundane. That is, until we uncovered something strange. While digging near the center of the site, one of my colleagues, Sarah, called out to me. She had unearthed something large, something that didn't look like it belonged with the rest of the artifacts. It was a stone slab, intricately carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. The moment I touched it, I felt a chill run through my body. My skin prickled and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know why, but I had an overwhelming sense that this was not just an artifact. It was something more, something ancient and alive. We decided to move the stone slab carefully, but as we did, the ground beneath us began to tremble. A low rumble filled the air, and the sky seemed to darken. The other members of the team looked at each other, confused and uneasy. I didn't know what to make of it. We had disturbed the earth, but it felt like something more was at play here. That night, as I sat in my tent, I began to hear strange noises outside. Soft whispers, footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. It was right outside my tent, heavy and labored, as if someone or something was waiting for me to step outside. I didn't dare move. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, hoping whatever it was would go away. After what felt like hours, the sound faded, and I finally allowed myself to breathe again. The next day, things only got worse. As we continued our excavation, strange occurrences began to happen more frequently. Tools would go missing, only to be found later in strange places. The temperature would drop suddenly, and we would feel an intense cold, even when the sun was shining brightly. I began to notice that the team members were starting to act strangely too. Sarah, who had always been calm and collected, began having nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, her face pale with fear. John, our historian, became increasingly paranoid. He would constantly check his surroundings, as if he were being watched, and he kept muttering under his breath about the spirits of the past. One evening, as the sun set, I was walking back to the camp when I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the site, where we had uncovered the stone slab, there was a figure standing in the distance. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, and it seemed to be watching us. I called out, but it didn't respond. I rushed to get closer, but when I reached the spot, there was no sign of anyone. The air around me was thick with an unnatural silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. That night, everything came to a head. We were all gathered around the campfire, trying to shake off the uneasy tension that had settled over the site when the ground began to shake again. This time it was much stronger. The fire flickered wildly, and the air grew heavy. Suddenly, the earth split open near the stone slab, and from it, a low, guttural growl emanated. We all froze, staring in disbelief as the ground continued to crack and shift. I don't know what happened next. Everything went black, and the next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground, my head pounding. The rest of the team was scattered around me, unconscious but alive. The site was in ruins. The stone slab had been destroyed, and the excavation pit was now a deep, jagged hole, as though something had burst out from beneath the earth. We managed to get back to town, but none of us were the same. Sarah never spoke again, her eyes hollow and lifeless. John disappeared shortly after, and we later found out he had been wandering the woods, talking to himself about the spirits we had disturbed. As for me, I tried to forget. I tried to move on with my life, but the memories haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the figure standing in the shadows, waiting. The whispers, the growls. I knew then that we hadn't just uncovered an ancient civilization. We had awakened something that should have stayed buried. The town of Oldbrook? It's still there, but the site has been abandoned. No one goes near it anymore. They say the earth itself is cursed. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the whispers coming from the forest, just faint enough that you might think you imagined them. But I know better. I know what we awakened, and I'll never forget it. I've left archaeology behind. No amount of ancient relics can make me forget what happened at that excavation site. Whatever was beneath that ground, it's still out there, waiting for the next person to disturb it. I hope that whoever they are, they never make the same mistake we did.